Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Unavowed for PC and Mac. This is a point-and-click adventure game by Wadjet Eye Games that was released last week for PC and Mac, and it does try to bring some different ideas to the table, first off being an urban fantasy game, which we don't really get a whole lot of, really. And on top of that, it brings a party system into the mix, which is something that you really don't think of at all for an adventure game. That's not to say that similar ideas haven't been done before in adventure games, where you do have multiple characters that are interacting with things as you're going along. But in this particular case, you actually swap out who you're taking with you whenever you go out to investigate the various areas and solve the various mysteries. So the question really becomes, how well does that work out for the game, and more importantly, how is this as an adventure game as a whole? Well, let's go ahead and delve right into it and find out. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation. Now, you do have to keep in mind that this is a 2D game running in the Adventure Game Studio engine, and it's twice the resolution that they normally use for these Wadjet Eye games, which in this particular case means 640 by 360. Doesn't seem like a lot, but then you take a look and you see that it's all pixel art and it's done in the style of old school adventure games, and it all makes sense. And for the most part, it's very well done pixel art, although there are a few issues with the characters, particularly with certain animations being a bit wonky here and there. But by and large, you've got some pretty solid character animations, and the environments in particular are absolutely fantastic. They're all absolutely packed with detail, and they really fit that urban fantasy vibe that they were going for, so in the visual side of things, they've definitely done a great job. But then you move over into sound design, and you find that that's also rather strong as well. Considering the genre, the sound effects do exactly what they need to do, but they don't really do anything more than that, and the soundtrack is a nice mix of styles that both fit the general vibe that the game is going for, as well as the individual moments where each track pops up. But then there's the one element of the sound design that kind of steals the show, and that's because of how prominent it is, which is the voice acting. All of the characters are voiced in this game, except for the player character, because the player character gets to choose different dialogue options, and all of those characters are voiced rather well, which is something we've really come to expect from Wadjet Eye Games at this point. If you've played other Wadjet Eye games before, you'll certainly recognize a fair few voices in this as people who've also done voice work for previous Wadjet Eye games, but there are a fair few new actors in there as well, and they all fit in quite well. Now, all that said, while the voice acting is certainly one of the strongest elements of the sound design, it also comes with one of the bigger detriments, which is simply a lack of consistency among everything in it. For the most part, it's all very consistent and it's very high quality for an indie game. But then there are the different hallmarks of certain aspects of indie game development, like for example, when you talk to certain NPCs, and you can tell they were recorded in a completely different environment, as well as in some cases with actually much lower quality equipment and mixing.
I'm fine, why does everybody keep asking me that?
Hey Chipman, you got paying customers. You want to stay open or what?
Fine, sorry.
Luckily, moments like that are fairly few and far between, so it doesn't really become that much of an issue, but when it does come up, it is something you do notice. But when you bring all the presentation together, you find that the issues that do exist aren't really enough to become that big of a deal because everything else compensates. Here's the thing, as strong as the presentation is, what really matter are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this takes place in modern-day New York City, where you play as a character of one of 3 different origin stories, and you can either pick male or female as well, and you even get to name the character yourself, that is possessed by a demon and cuts a bloody swath through the city and causes all kinds of mayhem. And you encounter a couple of characters who are part of this organization known as the Unavowed, who exorcise the demon from you, and basically tell you that they are the bulwark against the darkness that has been becoming more and more of a problem over the past few months. Without any other options available to you, you end up joining the Unavowed and go about helping them to figure out what exactly is going on, why there's so many new incidences of horrible things happening, and ultimately trying to stop it all. But unlike most other adventure games, it's not just you going out there and trying to solve everything on your own. You have different characters that will help you along the way, starting with the 2 that rescue you at the beginning, who are the Fire Mage Eli Beckett and the half-Djinn Mandana, and later on you can recruit 2 additional characters who are a Bestower, which if you've played the Blackwell series is going to be very familiar to you, as well as a Detective. Now I'll discuss their gameplay implications a bit later because they do bring their own strengths and weaknesses to the table, but suffice to say, the story gets a lot more complicated the further you get in, and it ends up being the strongest element in the game, so I don't really want to spoil too much of it for you, so I've been trying to avoid spoilers in the gameplay footage as much as I possibly can, but even with my discussion of the story, about the most I can really say without spoiling too much of it is that the demon that possessed you has been very busy in the year you've been possessed, and you end up having to basically clean up the mess and figure out why they were doing it in the first place, and more importantly, stop its plans from coming to fruition. It only gets more interesting the further things are revealed, and you find that you do actually have a say in how the story unfolds. You'll be faced with various choices throughout the game, none of which are easy choices, I might add, and they actually can have pretty significant implications on how things unfold later on. This all culminates with multiple endings depending on what you did throughout the game, as well as what you actually choose at the very end, which is a mild disappointment because the final choice is really just a choice given to you at the very end, and that determines your ultimate ending. That's not to say that the endings are bad or poorly done, it's to say that it would be more interesting if the choices you made throughout the game have a more significant impact on the ultimate outcome. But what we do have in Unavowed is certainly satisfying enough, so that's something they may want to consider for future games if they decide to continue with the multiple choices along the way, as well as the multiple endings idea. But regardless, the writing's got it where it counts. It's got strong dialogue, it's got characters who remain interesting throughout the game, and as you learn more about them, they actually only become more interesting. And most importantly, the story holds your interest throughout, so they've done an excellent job with all of the writing in this thing. But that's only part of the picture. Certainly the most important part of an adventure game, but not the only important part. Which leads me over to the gameplay, where things get a bit messier. You see, in a lot of ways this is a fairly traditional point-and-click adventure game in the sense that you're going around, you're investigating things, you're talking to people, and you're solving puzzles. Now, depending on where they come up in the game and what your party makeup is at the time, you're going to have different solutions to the puzzles, some of which are more obvious and easier than others. Now, of course, in some cases that simply involves finding an item somewhere in the environment and using it on either a specific NPC or some other object in the environment, and you just go about your merry way after that. But a lot of times you'll also find that your party makeup is more important for solving certain puzzles than anything else. So, for example, at the very beginning of the game, you only have those two characters, Eli and Mandana, and thus you only really have one way of approaching things. But once you get access to the bestower and the detective, then things can shift. You'll have different ways of solving certain puzzles, you'll have different puzzles that were not even possible for you to interact with at the beginning, but now you can actually interact with them in full. And that actually pretty heavily alters the gameplay dynamic and makes things more interesting for multiple playthroughs. So to give you an idea of how this can play out in the actual gameplay, without spoiling too much here, at one particular part of the game you need to get a cup of hot water, so you can do this one of two different ways. If you have Eli in your party, he can actually heat up a kettle that's in plain view, and thus you have hot water right there. If you don't have Eli in the party, however, then you need to go find a way to get hot water instead. And that brings up something important to mention about how this game being party-based actually affects the general gameplay, which is that the puzzles have to be designed in such a way that you can complete them with any party combination, no matter what that combination is. This can lead to a lot of the puzzles being a bit too easy, and that's actually the general problem I've found with most of the puzzles in the game. It's just that they're really easy to figure out. It's not really a problem if you go into it for the narrative and the character interactions and such, but it is more of a problem if you go into an adventure game and you expect some really challenging puzzles. So just keep that in mind if you decide to go into this thing and you're expecting some moon logic puzzles. You don't really get any of those here. They're all pretty logical, and in most cases they're almost a bit too easy. But of course that gives you more time and energy to focus on the story and the characters, which are really the game's biggest strong suit. And with the multiple origins available to your character, as well as the different variations of party makeup that you can have that will alter the way that puzzles play out and the way that the ultimate gameplay dynamic flows, it gives you quite a bit of replay value. I mean, to give you an idea, I got 3 full playthroughs out of this before I decided to make a review, and there were still some combinations I missed, so there's still some replay value even though I've already completed the game 3 times. And I really can't think of much more glowing praise than that, because those playthroughs were one right after the other. It wasn't a matter of, oh, I'm gonna take a break. I actually finished playthrough 1, and then I immediately started playthrough 2. And it has been many years since I last did that. In fact, I think the last time I did that was with Dragon Age 2, so that should tell you just how interesting the game ends up being, and ultimately how high of a quality it is. But here's the thing, you're really only going to get the absolute most out of this game if you've already played through the Blackwell series. So if you haven't played the Blackwell series, I very highly recommend you go ahead and pick those up before you play through Unavowed, because then you'll be able to get the most out of it. Plus, all those games are well worth playing anyway, so it's a win-win scenario if you do that. But even if you take it solely on its own, Unavowed is an excellent adventure game that is well worth playing for any fan of the genre, and the addition of the party system as well as the multiple choices and consequences throughout the game are going to keep you interested for multiple playthroughs, meaning you're going to get plenty of value out of this thing if you do decide to pick it up. Ultimately, I give it a 4 out of 5. Like I've said before, it does have a few issues that bring it down a bit, but it's nothing that's really going to be a major issue for you, and if you're a fan of adventure games, or especially if you're a fan of Wadjet Eye Games already, then you definitely want to pick it up. Thanks for watching.